Welcome to Moving People Forward with Mark Elfstrand. This program is a series of conversations on commonly seen challenges in everyday people's lives. We hope you'll be inspired by the stories you hear today. Perhaps you know of someone who would also benefit. Be sure to share the program link with a friend. Now, here's Mark.
The Wheaton Eye Clinic is highly regarded in the Chicagoland area with multiple locations. They average between 13 to 15,000 phone calls each month with approximately 170,000 patient visits. The founders had a strong Christian faith and mindset to serve others. They were missionaries. I'm one of their patients, and I've been blessed by the care and treatment of their doctors. The eye, actually, of course, is an amazing organ. With me today on Moving People Forward is Dr. David Gieser, an ophthalmologist and glaucoma specialist at the clinic and son of the founding family. Dr. Gieser, welcome.
Thank you. Just delighted to be with you.
Well, your family really has quite a history, and your parents were a bold and a determined couple. Take us back to their time as missionaries.
Well, it all began at Wheaton College. They met there, and upon graduation in 1930, my father went on to medical school. And during those college years, that passion to be missionaries grew. And finally, in 1934, off they went for China. They headed off what was a 3-week trip in the lower cabins of a freighter across the Pacific before they finally arrived in Shanghai.
Yeah, but then they went out to a more remote location, did they not?
They did indeed. And they were there in some 40, 50 miles from the closest road at one point and on a canal. But they found that it was the most memorable, joyous experiences of their entire life. It's
interesting to hear you say that, though, because the Japanese were not necessarily being friendly to China at that time.
At that time, I don't know to what degree the tensions were. This was 1934,
right.
But it was in 1937 that the Japanese invaded China.
And your parents were impacted by this at some point, is that correct?
Absolutely. The Japanese invaded China in 1937, but here's the interesting point. Long in 1938, with part of China occupied, they decided it was time to come home. So they came back to Wheaton for a furlough, but then decided they were so called of God to return back to the people of China. They returned to a war zone, a country that had partially been invaded by the Japanese army, where their hospital, however, was still under Chinese control.
Wow.
And they didn't know what they were getting into.
Yeah.
So they arrived in Shanghai, and the Shanghai of 1934, when they first arrived as missionaries, had been dramatically transformed, because now the Japanese army with tanks, armored personnel carriers, troops marching up and down the streets were present, and yet out in the country was the hospital in Chinese-controlled territory that they wished to once again to return to serve.
Okay, so occasionally, your parents had to go into bomb shelters?
Well,
right?
They first had to navigate themselves out of Shanghai.
I see, yeah.
And they got on a canal boat. Now, at that point, there weren't hostilities between China and hostilities between Japan and the United States. So they had a United States flag on their canal boat. So they made the canal boat out of Shanghai with an American flag and approached the Japanese front lines. They cautiously went by and then continued their no man's land, and then they approached the Chinese front lines. There's no radio, there's no telephone, they have no idea what they're getting into. Yet they approach the Chinese lines and they're stopped. But the Chinese knew of the work of the hospital where my mom and dad had spent their preceding few years.
Wow.
And they were allowed to pass.
Your father actually helped a very political person, though, escape from the Japanese. Is that right?
That's part of the story. They arrived in China in their hospital, and they could hear the guns and the cannons of the Japanese army approaching. And in due course, of course, their little town, their hospital, was occupied by the Japanese forces. But even so, they continued to provide medical care in that little hospital. Well, one night, in the midst of the Japanese-occupied town, there's a bang on the door. And my father went to the front door with some others, and there was the commanding officer of the city. And he bowed low to my father and said, "There's a dangerous bad man in your hospital, and we've come to get him." And my father bowed back and said, "No, I don't think there is, but please come in." And then with a whistle, the troops surrounded the hospital compound, which was a 9-foot wall enclosure with multiple hospital buildings. And then 20 troops or so stormed into the compound, set up machine guns, and this officer went right to the women's hospital. And the light went on in my father's head. Because the night before, he had delivered the baby of a colonel in the Chinese army. And that colonel, of course, had visited his newborn. But they had gotten wind something was going to happen. And the night before, my dad had helped that man, that colonel of the Chinese army, go over the wall and to safety. And meanwhile, the next night, the Japanese military arrives in that woman's room, and she's holding her newborn. Whereupon the officer turns and bows to my father and says, "There's been a mistake," and left.
Wow.
But I reflected on the risk he took, because he had developed some relationships with the Japanese commanding forces, and would go into the headquarters and would hear the torture and the beatings going on. And yet he stood by the Chinese people and delivered the baby and allowed that gentleman to escape.
So did you consider, or did they consider this time to be adventurous? I mean, most people would consider that dangerous.
Well,
an environment to work in.
One of the phrases in my father's diary is enduring the agony of understanding God's will. Twice my mom, with a 1-year-old, missionaries say, "You have got to get out of here, Kay. It is dangerous." And one night she was up literally most of the night praying, "God, give me some sense of what I should do."
Was that 1-year-old you?
And that was my older brother.
Your older brother, okay.
And she came to the realization and said, "No, Ken, I'm staying with you. God brought us here.
Wow.
And whatever comes, we trust him."
So how many years were they there in China before?
From 1934 to 1940.
All right. Well, we're going to be taking a time out, and when we continue our conversation here with Dr. David Gieser, what we're going to find out about is when they returned to the United States, they decided to set up shop to do, eye care. And that has become quite a story of its own, and we're going to get to that coming up here in just a moment. But right now, we'll take this short break and then continue our discussion with Dr. David Gieser, ophthalmologist and glaucoma specialist at the Wheaton Eye Clinic in Illinois.
God is our safe place and our strength. He is always our help when we are in trouble. This word of God in Psalm 46:1 says it all. God is our safe place. He is our strength. He is our help when we are in trouble. Whenever and wherever we are invited, nationally or internationally, Lutheran Church Charity's mission is to bring the mercy, compassion, presence, and proclamation of Jesus Christ to those who are suffering and in need. LCC is a ministry of presence, to be present with Jesus, to lift up people in times of joy and sorrow, in prayer, and by passing through donations of dollar per dollar to those in need. Through our canine ministries, we respond and deploy with boots on the ground and paws within 24 hours, often sooner, of any crisis or disaster situation we're invited into. Our LCC disaster response teams continue our support, both financially and with our dedicated volunteers, for those communities during their long, long-term recovery and efforts, which can be years. Disaster response teams also train volunteers through our alert training to equip volunteers to respond to the various types of disasters. LCC's Human Care Ministries work through our churches and pastors to provide financial and in-kind donations, people resources, and emotional and spiritual care. We have strong partnerships with churches and Christian ministries across the U.S. and internationally. You see, for us, the bottom line is make it a difference by being present. For people who are suffering and in need with that mercy, compassion, presence of Jesus Christ. Thank you again for allowing us the privilege to stand alongside and serve others. Jesus and your partnership make that possible to touch thousands of lives.
This is Moving People Forward. I'm Mark Elfstrand, and we're discussing the missionary history behind the highly respected Wheaton Eye Clinic with several Illinois locations. My guest is Dr. David Gieser, the ophthalmologist and glaucoma specialist at the clinic and the son of the founding family. Now, you also have some history with Wheaton College. In fact, I think you still sort of do, right?
Yes, I've beginning my 32nd year on the board of trustees and 9 years as chairman of the board. And my wife and I met at Wheaton.
All right. So Wheaton College kind of plays into this story in a quite interesting fashion because as your parents were in China, the supervising physician, tell me a little bit about that person.
Well, when my parents arrived in China, there were two doctors supervising my father, who was just out of medical school, Dr. Woods and Dr. Bell. And Dr. Bell had two young daughters approaching college age, Ruth and Rosa. And Dr. Bell got to know Ken and Kay Gieser, and he asked some questions because he liked Ken and Kay Gieser, and he figured, where did you go to college? Because I appreciate you so much. I'd like to know where you went to college because I'm thinking this is the kind of place I'd like to have my daughters attend. And he learned they attended Wheaton College, and he said if that's where Ken and Kay Gieser went, that's where Ruth and Rosa are going to go to school.
Okay, so Ruth goes off to college there, and then doesn't she meet a rather interesting, fascinating young man?
Well, in 1940, after my parents had returned from China, Ruth started to mention to my parents about this tall Southerner, who she really liked, who was preaching Sunday nights in a local building, and would they like to hear him speak? And his name was Billy Graham.
I see.
And every Saturday night he would pack the basement of the old Masonic Hall in downtown Wheaton, and that was the start of that relationship. And my mom and dad would chuckle because Ruth was this quiet Southern Presbyterian, and my dad would listen to Billy and say, how could she be interested in this loud Baptist preacher? And somehow it all happened. And my mom and dad attended their wedding in 1943, and the rest is history.
Yeah, well, that friendship, though, continued for a long time.
A long time. In 1947, my dad was on to his way to Kano, Nigeria to work, and he knew for about a month to do some eye surgery. He knew that Billy was preaching in small locations in London. And so he stopped and visited with him. And sure enough, Billy was working for Youth for Christ at the time, and he would preach to 50 to 60 people
big crowd.
at a time, and they come back on the train and stay at the Cumberland Hotel and then go out again. And then one night, on a rainy day, on the upper deck of a London double-decker bus, they were driving by Royal Albert Hall, and Billy said to my father, someday, Ken, I'm going to come back and fill it, referring to Royal Albert Hall.
And what would be the seating be of that?
About 5,000.
Okay.
And my father said to Billy, Preachers don't do that kind of thing.
I see.
But then in 1966, I was sitting with my mom and dad
Yeah.
in Earl's Court, along with my sister,
Ah,
seating 18,000 people. And over a month's time, he spoke to 1 million people in London.
oh, what a great friendship. To
It was a
have,
great friendship
over the
for life.
years. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about then the foundation of the Wheaton Eye Clinic. I mean, this has become such a remarkably successful a group in the Chicagoland area. But how did that get started?
Well, my folks returned from China.
Yeah.
They were emotionally shocked because of the experiences of being in an occupied country.
Right.
Then my dad came down with malaria,
Oh my God.
and he was advised to say, general surgery, obstetrics, that's gone. Do something simple and small. And so, okay, I'll become an eye doctor. And he received his training in Chicago. But in the back of his mind, he always had this desire, this hope of having his own little clinic, perhaps in that little town of Wheaton, 25 miles west of Chicago, where they had met.
Right.
And so the day came that he had a box of used equipment, and he would rent the waiting room of a dentist for $2.50 a night,
I see.
Thursday nights and Saturday nights. Strange way to start a clinic.
Yeah.
But the dentist, of course, wouldn't trust him in the exam rooms. He had to do all of his work in the waiting room.
I see. So how many patients a year now does the Wheaton Eye Clinic see?
We're now seeing nearly 170,000 patient visits per year.
Yeah. Now, I know at least in one location that I have visited that there is a statement about what God does and what the doctor does that people can see when they come in to the clinic. I think it's like on a banner or
It's
something
on,
like that.
yes. Well, the doctor works, but God heals.
But God heals. Right.
And that's an underlying principle, to serve people, provide superb care, but do it with compassion.
Yeah. Now, do you ever find that there's a line that you cross in having a consultation with a patient where you know that they're struggling? I mean, I'm sure a lot of your patients are elderly as well and probably have fears going on in their life. Does that ever cross from just being an eye doctor to somebody who has to offer a deeper level of care?
Frequently. I take care of a disease called glaucoma.
Yes.
It's silent. It's lifelong. It has to be treated continually. There's no cure,
Yeah.
such like as a cataract surgery, in, out, over.
Yeah.
So my dear patients, I've seen now some of them for 30, 40 years, every 3 or 4 months. You get to know them.
Yeah.
And at times when I sense their stress, their concern, something's not going right, I'll ask, may I pray with you? And I did so yesterday. A man who has an abdominal aneurysm, who's waiting for his death, and you stop and pray. Sometimes the folks are just staring at the ceiling. They don't get it. And I can't say much given the nature of medicine and the nature of my time,
Right.
but they know and hear a word that Jesus loves them.
So in the work that you do, you can perhaps reflect on King David's statement in Psalm 139 that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. How do you, what's your perspective on that as it relates to the human eye?
It's stunning. Inside our eye is a retina. It's like the film of a camera. It has 250 million little nerve fibers in just the retina. And then it funnels down into a nerve that goes to the brain. And all the beautiful intricate interconnections of the retina are compressed into 1 million nerve fibers, which is in the nerve that goes to the brain. Now consider the absolute astonishing intricacy. 250 million nerve fibers in your little eye, beautifully compressed into the nerve of 1 million nerve fibers. And what's the thickness of the nerve? Less than a pencil.
Wow.
All individually isolated. Brilliant design, and not by chance.
But not by chance, right? And anybody who works in that field should that's just one piece of the human body that
That's
you could get an amazing aspect.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, well, you do a wonderful work, and your doctors do as well. As I said, I've seen a few of them in my time in Chicago, and they always treat me well and with good care. And you can tell that reflects the character of the family behind the Wheaton Eye Clinic. So, Dr. David Gieser, thank you for being with us today to kind of tell us some interesting family history and also about the Wheaton Eye Clinic.
Honored to be with you.
And thank you for watching us today as we close our program. As the sages have told us, grow in wisdom, think humbly of yourself, and love one another. And may it be so with you. And by the way, if you're looking for more information on the Wheaton Eye Clinic, won't be hard to find. All you have to do is just put that phrase in your search engine. You'll come up with plenty of information, the Wheaton Eye Clinic. Join me next time for more of Moving People Forward. I'm Mark Elfstrand.